Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, Iowa Catholic Radio. We are in Des Moines, Iowa. We are in the Diocese of Des Moines, and we are broadcast live on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network here in various places throughout Iowa, Bud. But if you were driving through on I-35 or I-80 in various places, you will hear us live that way. Or maybe you're listening on iowacatholicradio.com across the world, the Iowa Catholic Radio app. And then, of course, everyone listening to our podcast, thank you for joining the show. It is wonderful to have you with us. I am Bo Bonner, and I, like Bud, work at Mercy College of Health Sciences, where I'm the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing. Bud, what do you do at the old place?
I'm the Associate Provost at Mercy College of Health Sciences, and the air is warm, the flowers are abloom. The Cubs are in last place. Spring is here.
That's right.
No. Actually, I don't know if I can throw shade because I think the Cards have had a rough start to the season. So
we've won some.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time this summer to make fun of the Cubs.
That's right.
What's going on at the old college these days?
Well, so not too long ago, we inaugurated our fourth president, Dr. Adrian Henry. We had quite a showing out, all sorts of people, all sorts of community support. So we want to say thank you to everybody who made it to any of the inauguration ceremonies and festivities. It was a wonderful time. We're getting ready to celebrate a graduation coming up here pretty soon, too. So April has been a complete busy whirlwind of fun. So we're getting done with the spring semester, getting ready to start with a summer one. So we want to thank Mercy College for underwriting our show, mchs.edu, all sorts of ways, Bud, that people can jump into careers in medicine here at Mercy College of Health Sciences.
Well, I want to say, Bo, I can lead our listeners astray in various ways on the show, but I did not lead them astray. I remember the weeks leading up to the inauguration. I was like, you should attend the 9 a.m. Mass on Friday. It's going to be amazing, 9 a.m. Mass. And Bishop Joensen knocked it out of the park.
Yes.
You sent me the text of his homily. If it's recorded, people need to go and find it. But I guess it was wind in my sails. And what I mean by that is it's great to be at a college where the pastor of the diocese was there at the inauguration and really gave us a convicting message about the call, the extreme responsibility that we've been given at Mercy College of Health Sciences to live out the legacy of the Sisters of Mercy. So that was really cool.
No, I think I know that the out-of-towners, many of them involved with Mercy, either at other Mercy colleges or Mercy in some way, multiple people wanted the text of that precisely because they said, hey, this is such a wonderful reflection on what we do in Catholic education, but then specifically with how the Sisters of Mercy play into that. He even threw in some Bishop Joensen humor about the difference between Texans and Iowans. Dr. Henry is not Texan. He's from Mississippi, but he's been in Texas for a while. So it was poignant. It was funny. And it just really, I think, like you said, inspired people. I think that's basically a description of our show too, but I'm just throwing that out there.
That should be the tagline, I think. No, any opportunity to have some fun at Texans' expense. We have Texans in our life that we both love.
Sort of.
But don't want to live there.
No, it was all fantastic. It was wonderful we got to be basically MCs of different parts of the festivities. Yeah. And I have to say, thank goodness for the radio as practice to be able to speak in front of that many people.
Well, I don't want to sound too bitter, but at your luncheon when you were MCing, I felt like the school gave you free rein to develop some of your own punchlines, whereas the installation ceremony, some of it was scripted. And I don't want to say it constrained me as a comedian, but I don't think it allowed the full display of my abilities.
No, I think that the big difference, Bud, is that they did give me a script. I just didn't follow it the entire time.
I didn't know that was an option.
It's an option when you're a Bonner.
Okay. Well, we have a great theme for the show today. So we've been this whole year looking some at the liturgy and keeping the liturgy in view, the church calendar. And this time of year, like our thoughts were turning bow today to the Great Commission. So we're moving towards the celebration of our Lord's ascension into heaven. And around that same time, Christ, of course, gives the command to the disciples to go into all the world, teaching all the nations, all that I've commanded you. That's a lot of alls, but baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we want to use this time of year in today's show to talk about evangelism and to think about it at a deeper level.
This is the Uncommon Good. Stick around. We'll be back talking exactly about that. We're back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Whether you access said show live via the radio waves here in central Iowa or iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app. Then, of course, our lovely podcast listeners. It's wonderful for you to be with us. We are glad you are listening. So, Bud, in terms of the church year calendar and how it maps onto the readings for, of course, the Gospels, but the New Testament in general, it's always this time of year when we're getting a healthy dose of the book of Acts, which obviously Acts of the Apostles. You get some people, I've heard it more and more frequently, Acts of the Holy Spirit, right? The coming of the age of the Paraclete and how he spreads his Spirit and the Word of Christ through the actions of the apostles. And then, of course, the book of Acts itself sort of ends open-ended because, of course, we ourselves are living in that age of the Spirit, that age of the apostles sending forth. So I guess in this time period, it would be good to talk about what's going on in the book of Acts, but not just, sort of book review. This is what the summary of things that are happening. But what does it mean that we are living in that age is extended this long, and that it's really about spreading the gospel, the good news, and the reality of the Holy Spirit. All things seemingly a good occasion for us to dwell on here after Easter week.
Well, this topic is sort of near and dear to my heart because I grew up in a Christian tradition that talked a lot about evangelism. I think I may have mentioned this on a recent episode, but when I was younger, we were given ready-made tools for talking to people about the gospel, and it was supposed to be kind of like an elevator pitch. So the community that I was a part of kind of reduced it to what they called like the 4 spiritual laws. It was basically communicating to strangers sometimes that it's funny to think about like leading with this conversation, but that's how we went about it. So like, you're a sinner. The wages of sin is death. God sent his son. And if you place your faith in him, you'll be saved. And I feel like in the Catholic world, so after becoming Catholic, the pendulum in our communities almost swings too far the other direction, where there's kind of an allergy to that sort of approach. And what ends up happening is that we, and I'll speak for myself sometimes, like just rarely sort of like try to find ways to share the gospel or to talk to people about what God has done in our lives. Now, I think, Bo, there is a proper golden mean in this conversation, and I think it's great that we're talking about it on a show where the central theme of the show is Catholic social teaching. If you go back to the Great Commission, so before our Lord ascends to heaven, he gives the disciples a Great Commission where he says, "Go ye into all the world, teaching all nations the gospel, all that I've commanded you, and baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." So there's the two-pronged, there's the command to baptize those to whom the disciples are sent, but also to teach them all that I've commanded you. And at the end of the day, for me, and we can sort of unpack this in the rest of the show, Bo, the Great Commission or the call to evangelism is about the kingship of Christ. So at the end of the show, I can't say it with the same flair you do, but you talk about Christ being king in our hearts, in our families, our communities, the city, nation, the entire galaxy, whole kit and caboodle, et cetera, et cetera. So it begins in our hearts. And last week on the show, we talked about like the dangers of sort of like a coercive mentality as we go about this. And that's where the 4 spiritual laws probably like dashed against the rocks, where it's kind of like reduced to changing someone's mind. There's the preaching that has to take place, but it really is calling all peoples to accept or to live in such a way that they acknowledge the kingship of Christ, which St. Paul tells us everyone will in the end.
I think I, of course, grew up evangelical as well. What's interesting to me is so much of the modern evangelical debates. So maybe if you go back in time and think about the Reformation, or if you think about when the Reformation churches got their start in America in the 1700s and 1800s, it might be different, although not completely with what I'm about to say. But a lot of the evangelical evangelicism that is expected, even in those cultures that we grew up in, Bud, presumes vast majority of Christian culture.
Yeah.
So even if it was like you're going to go talk to the heathen, whoever the heathen might be, half the time those Catholics with where I was growing up, the idea is you could appeal to things like sin and not need to spend multiple sessions with this stranger talking about what sin is in the first place. So you're right, like the elevator pitch assumes a lot. And so a lot of the times, even when we talk about evangelization in America, it's slowly not being the case here. But even when we talk about the knowns and the rise of the knowns and all of these things like this, it is still a group of people that if you brought up sin, they would largely know what the term is. They might have an opposition to it. But I think about how with the Acts of the Apostles, two things are happening. On one hand, they do have a community that they share a lot of preconceived notions with, but that would be the Jews of their time. And we get a lot of examples of what that looks like. But the big difference is going to Gentiles who, yes, some of the God-fearers, and that might be the people, and so real quick, historically for people, there were quite a few Gentiles that were interested in the Jewish religion and saw themselves as sort of like fellow travelers, but, you know, they didn't make the big jump through circumcision or other things like that. And we do seem to show that Paul and his friends would go to them first, but we also have Paul straight up talking to, like, Greek philosophers in the Areopagus and appealing to their scriptures and poems without necessarily citing one verse of what would be the scriptures at the time, the Old Testament. And so in Acts, we have two variants of what evangelization will end up looking like. What would it mean to evangelize people who've never heard the Gospels? And then what would it be like to evangelize people who have heard common stories or have common roots with you that don't necessarily believe what you do? And, of course, I'll have to say, of course, there are evangelicals, but who actually do go evangelize in places in which no one has heard. I think that's where people will argue, sort of in the modern era, where it's like, yeah, but, you know, you're like bringing in like food and water supplies or stuff like this. But even putting that aside, largely, I think, but when we think of evangelization, we get tripped up with this point you're making, that this is actually about the kingdom of God spreading, and so that it's more than just intellectual arguments. But we kind of assume that evangelization, spreading the good news, is an appeal to arguments that most people, even in our age, at least have some cultural familiarity with. And to me, that's the big hang-up why we get stuck in the dead ends. Like you said, we're trying to find a mean between two extremes, but we really swing between the two extremes because we've over-intellectualized what we're really up to, it seems to me.
Well, I have an observation and then a question for you. I like jumping into the interview seat. And
nice.
Yeah. So when I read the book of Acts, and in fact all of the New Testament, I'm struck with how much spade work is involved in evangelism. So you mentioned Paul's encounter with Greek philosophers at the Areopagus, and he sees the idols that they've created, and one of them is a statue to the unknown God. And St. Paul starts this incredibly nuanced, like, philosophical discourse with the individuals there who, like you said, they would have maybe very little reference to salvation history. You know, later in the New Testament, Paul says, he mentions this explicitly, like the mediatorial role of an evangelist, where he says, like, to the Jews, I have become Jews. To the Greeks, I have become Greeks. And then later, like, in the history of the church, you see this all the time where, like, when the Jesuits go to China, there's this cultural mediation that has to take place. And it's almost like with evangelism, the starting point is a deep dive into the culture and mindset of the people you're trying to reach. And I guess my question for you then, since I don't want to answer it, is let's start like not with other nations, but with our own. As you like interact with college students at Mercy College of Health Sciences, or I know you also teach, I mean, you of course teach like catechized young adults at St. Thomas Catholic Academy. But where do you see, like, reading the cultural vibes in America, like, since we can't necessarily assume that, like, this language of sin and grace and talking about Jesus is going to gain traction, like, where are a lot of people at today?
Yeah, that's why when I teach them, I was like, That's cap, bro. No, I'm kidding. So one of the things that, I mean, I'm being an idiot there, but it's important to point out that what we're not saying is you have to translate for the times. Like, to me, this is another way in which the mean gets lost, is what we're not saying is, oh, grace is like, the gospel is like an influencer, and salvation is like you being your best self, you know. There's ways in which you have to know that stuff and go, hey, you know how there's a lot of influencers and they just seem to really be at this idea that they know they're not the best self, but they can't get there. That might be an entry point, right, into the questions that the culture has. But, I mean, but even when you're talking about the Jesuits and their interaction with China, there's these huge questions about what is the right, prudent way. You have to translate it into their language. So there's the immediate questions of which words do you use for concepts that don't completely match up. So I know famously, right, there's a question of what word in Chinese you use for heaven, because they seem to have a sense of heaven that would be, I guess, discordant with the Christian one, for instance. Or what do you use for Lord or God, right? You know, you have to be careful about overloaded words. Okay, but that's very...
And do you build on rites they already have in place? Like, they had rituals and ways they honored the dead. Can that map onto, like, the intercessions that we offer for the faithful departed? Yeah,
and for anybody who's in Des Moines, for instance, if you go to... Is it St. Peter's where the Vietnamese community meets? So you can hear how they do the rosary, and that is sort of an adaptation of at least musical elements, I think, from Vietnamese Buddhism that have been applied to the rosary. So, of course, this has to happen. Anybody who goes like, oh, I don't know if we should do that, if you pray novenas, you're taking part of Latinate Roman paganism, and you've applied it to the prayer life of the church. So this is unavoidable, but beyond, and I think this is what you're getting at, beyond the practical ramifications, like you must decide what words to use, or if you're going to force the introduction of a word that doesn't exist yet, now you have this idea of how do you speak to the desires and the fears and all of that time and place? And how do you point out that what they're asking, the questions that roil any society, are based in original sin, and that Christ is the answer to? But to say those things on endless repeat makes no sense unless you dive into that. So I think maybe that's why it seems hard for us, Bud, to truly dig into what evangelism looks like in 2023, because our culture has things like redemption and salvation, and they use a lot of the language from Christianity, but it's sort of lost its teeth. And so what, to your point, we have to say is, what is it that people are looking for? What are they afraid of? What is their desires? What do they think, is the problem at the center of life? And not stay, like make 1-to-1 ratio. Oh, well, you want this, but guess what? Here's the Christian version. Yeah. It's to understand where these things come from and then answer to it, which I think gets into as things as basic as how does, I know that we talk about, I do, digital technology and how that has changed the way we even look at things, and how we act and how our wills are formed. So we have to dig into that stuff, but the key is not saying the newest thing, but getting at the heart of what is setting people, their hearts either on fire or troubling them in this moment.
Well, there was an interesting point that you're making on a text conversation that we were having this weekend, and I kind of want to move there to that point. You were just saying you mentioned
the Cubs. Yeah, they're bad.
They're terrible.
No, okay.
No, I feel like the church at different times and in different places has unique temptations that it fits, and I kind of had this vibe recently. So I feel like in a lot of parts of church history, like the great evangelists or missionaries, we could say, They went into a culture and they were just like, you know what, I'm going to claim this for Christ, and they were sort of bold about it. So you mentioned, we've already mentioned the Chinese rites controversy, or the way that like novenas were rooted in paganism. We could talk about, like Guadalupe and how it matches on to the culture that existed there. But I'm starting to see a strain in American Catholicism specifically, where there's more of a suspicion with like popular culture. And so I don't know. I think it's sort of that we're moving to a place where Catholics do, in a sense, feel marginalized from the halls of power, especially like the dominant culture. So like if you look at like Hollywood and the arts and education, it feels like we're sort of under attack. And the impulse is to say, like, we have to bunker down or keep things at bay. And so, like, in this text conversation that I'm mentioning, like, you were talking about how when we look at digital technologies, a lot of times, like, Catholic parents, like, driven by a good impulse, are like, we're just going to toss it all out the window. But you were saying, like, we're actually strategically positioned where we can sort of, like, infiltrate these technologies. I don't know if that's the right term, but, like, actually harness them and sort of, like, to fight the bad parts, per se. It's not a matter of, like, keeping it at bay, but, like, redeeming it from inside.
I have to admit, for me, in America at least, a lot of the, we need to batten down the hatches and understand our Christianity is oppositional. I'll be honest, it's pretty Protestant, man.
Yeah.
Protestantism, of course, in the Reformation understood itself over against regnant Catholicism.
But what about St. Benedict? Didn't he batten down the hatches? No.
We'll get to that later.
Okay.
Maybe in the second half. But I'll say this, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you think about this, is that the Reformation, you know, it had, in ways it was easier for the Reformation to get started and to sort of whip itself into a fury because it had this hulking giant of power, the Catholic Church, that needed reformed. It was doing things bad, so it was defining itself over against the Catholic Church. Yeah. And so in America, this is what starts to be weird, is when Protestantism really does take over. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that historically even that's weird because entire sections of America were all Spanish and Catholic while America was fledgling. But let's just go with the sort of dominant idea about, you know, regnant Protestant American culture. But think about how in American history, how much throughout all of it, there's always, you know, like society, and then there's like the true patriots or the true evangelicals or the true Christians. And notice that like America is always going against a worse version of itself with a better version of itself. And if not American total, although I think that could probably be said of American total, it's definitely an American Protestantism. That's why we've had 3 great awakenings, right? And you're like, man, why do we keep falling asleep and needing all these awakenings? But there's something to it, right? But there's a sort of rhetorical move to say, society, we need to understand like the Christian core as over against it. Where in Europe, I mean, not even saying now, but like throughout European history, reform was maybe harder to initiate because everyone was like, well, we're all Catholic, including the bad ones. So I think, but it's very natural for us Catholics as Americans, and of course that's what the John F. Kennedy, you know, generation did, is like Catholics got to enter into the mainstream. And I actually think that's one of the things we've sort of absorbed for ourselves most. Yeah. So we're very prone to think like, to be a Christian means to be in opposition to whatever's popular. Why I think that doesn't work is it's only very few people who can skedaddle from things like the digital. You have to be a very specific type of person. But what I want to even argue is, even if you could pull that off, you yourself, you don't have cell phones, you don't watch screens, everybody sits down at night after lunch or at dinner and has violin concertos and things like this, the very few people who can do that still live in a world absolutely formed by the digital reality. And so this gets to what you were saying, I think is absolutely true. If you look at Christianity time and again, it's Christians being at the forefront of revolutionary, like not only just technological change, but technological revolutions in media to actually push forward the gospel, the good news. We're running out of time for this segment. In the second one, we can talk about the printing press, which is its whole deal. Ooh. But look, Christianity, bud, codices. So I know that this is like really dorky, but the idea that things aren't in scrolls, but they're actually in pages that you turn. Christians, especially the early Eastern monks, but then as it spread, codices is a revolution that occurred and is almost simultaneous to the Christian Revolution, because we didn't, scrolls, like there were people who literally held on to that, but this idea, right, that you would have books and that there were pages and that you can do things like have chapters and things like this, that is a Christian willingness to catch on, to bear the torch of a revolutionary change that not only was a technological change, but a way in which we thought about what we read. And the church was at the helm of this because they wanted to spread the good news. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, I was having one of those classic rambling on until the hard stop made me put a pause, which is good because I wouldn't have shut up. But I wanted to throw that over to you. You know, you were asking me the hard questions, so I throw that back to you.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a fair way, not like the grocery store, to understand? I mean, I'm wondering if there are some people who might even be like, wait, did Bo just say Catholics in America act like Protestants most of the time? But do you think there might be? Do you think there's something to this idea that we kind of share an American Protestant impulse to think that we must be oppositional to all things, and that there's like a sort of long history that maybe not all of Catholicism shares with that?
Well, I don't want to give you too much praise on air, but no, when you were talking at the end of that last segment, I was actually kind of challenged because I was thinking to myself, like, yeah, really, there is a very stark difference with Catholics and Protestants in this respect. And it's kind of ironic that, well, you know, like we're sort of like contrasting ourselves with Protestantism and saying like Catholicism is not properly the rejection of something. But I think it goes back to a fundamental theological idea. And that's, you know, like St. Thomas talks in this way, some theologians even before him, where they say grace builds on and perfects nature. And we can think about that with our own salvation. Like there is a certain kind of Protestant mentality that says like when God saves us, he saves us completely from ourselves. It's almost like he gives us a brand new nature. Like we're kind of replaced in a sense. Whereas in Catholic thought and Catholic theology, properly speaking, going back to the church fathers, grace builds on and perfects our nature. And there's an analogy to that with culture where we're not being drawn out of the world or saved in spite of the world, but the redemptive process takes up all of creation into, you know, this rambling order that's moving towards a glorious fulfillment. And so as American Catholics, we do have to be careful. Like some people have pointed out the sort of like Puritan mentality that we've inherited, but I think also we've maybe inherited more of an opposition mentality as well, where like in our relation to the broader culture, like faithfulness is a rejection of something. And the glorious part of this message, or like the really sort of like freeing part, is like when we think about evangelism, which we started the show with, we have like a gift to give, like something that others will want to receive. And that's sort of freeing. And when we think about that in relation to our current situatedness, even like with the kids, I think like there are these treasures, like, and in some ways, like if you are rooted in your local parish, you probably are seeing this sort of phenomenon. But the liturgy, in a lot of ways, speaks to what people are looking for. A couple weeks ago on the show, we talked about how like the digital revolution has driven young people to looking at the history of the liturgy, and they sort of want to like dive into this. But also, I think a lot of Americans who are looking for something more to life and they want to find meaning in their existence, like the kind of challenge of the liturgy, properly speaking, is something that they're like really sort of intrigued by. What I mean by the challenge is it's not necessarily just like easy to enter into immediately. It calls you to sort of like learn a new kind of language and to be patient with like the slowness of it and things like that. So I think there's a real opportunity there.
And I mean, immediately what I think people would misunderstand if they were being, I think, uncharitable, but maybe we're not being clear enough. What we're not saying, because again, virtue is a mean between two extremes. What this doesn't mean is we just baptize everything about a current culture and go oh, actually, it's great. Or, oh, we need to change what the church teaches so that people in the current culture don't have to change themselves in order to agree with us.
Real Housewives of Atlanta, let's just do a Catholic version.
Yeah, right. Oh, jeez. So, I mean, no, actually what we're talking about is the revolutionary power that this good news is. That why would you hide it under a bushel? And I mean, I think that's part of it, Bud, is like we don't hide our light from people, nor do we extinguish it or, I don't know, what put it on someone else's candle. We have a light worth, uncovering and letting people see. And so that means, of course, not being afraid of anything that any culture could throw at us. And so, yes, we should hate sin. We should help people who don't understand what they're doing as sin come to see, the great sorrow that is sin and the great, open path of life that is following God's word and his commandments and his beatitudes. But none of that is retreating, and none of that is hiding. And I think that starts to be this oppositional factoid that is the weird, random fact of history about how the Reformation went down in Europe and how that mentality really did plant deep seeds in the United States, so that now when Catholics become more in the mainstream than they ever were, they either do one of two things, it seems to me. They either totally kind of hand off to the culture and go like, well, let's just be culturally Catholic, but really Americans first. Or they're like, well, we need to stand against everything that the dominant culture does and lose our chance, bud, to be at the forefront of technological and media and information change, put that very broadly, which we've classically done. We have classically been the people who have invented the book and then, perfected it. Even when the Protestant Reformation really did stem from the invention of the printing press, and not only what that materially did different, that you could spread all of these words, but that it really did change how people thought. Maybe that the church was initially slow to really think about that, but the church did mount a defense. That's why we call it the Counter-Reformation. And it wasn't just replicating what the Protestants did with, sort of like strife bombing everybody with Luther's pamphlets. It really wasn't a reappreciation of what textuality means. But actually where I think this shows up the most is you start to see the Counter-Reformation art movements, where even the art begins to change to sort of answer the textuality of the Protestants. It's sort of like our art in our parishes even. We begin to make architecture that could be read. And so what was countering the pamphlets was not just, and we wrote pamphlets to sort of, write against them, the people who were writing against the church. But I think the most powerful efforts were made was in things like how architecture changed to be read as a text, counter the texts of the Reformation pamphlets.
Well, and I think the best denizens, or like those who modeled this sort of thing, the way they went about this is they had almost like, I call it like a good jealousy, where when they saw these technologies or ways of doing things happening, they're like, we're not going to let those guys have a monopoly on things. Like, we're going to do it the Catholic way and outdo it. So like, I think of my own field, like historians, like, and as like in the wake of the invention of the printing press, and as scholars like dove into the annals of history, Catholic scholars were like we're going to really, they would almost sort of wanted to prove things.
No, that's a great way to put it.
But in kind of defense, and I was going to say devil's advocate, but I don't want to mention the devil on the show, so I'll say like the Amish advocate. For those who are, so here's something I do struggle with. For those who are more resistant to the dominant culture, and they do have this kind of like more antagonistic mode, like it's really intriguing to me to kind of like look at the history of all this. If you go to the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in D.C., what's really cool is like in the lower level of the church, there's all these Marian shrines, and you see Our Lady kind of embodied in these different cultures. So like the apparitions that took place in different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And I think this is really cool, like when you look at art history, like how Catholic artists like used, like during the Renaissance, like what was dominant during that time, or, the redemption of like Romanesque architecture and things like that. I think those, I'm being a little long-winded here, but those who are more resistant to our culture today, what they kind of argue is like those cultures still had a transcendent reference point. So it was easier, or like Christians could build off of that. But like with modernism and like modern art, it's sort of bleak and flat. And it's like, I don't know, you do have examples of like sort of poorly done churches where they tried to pull off something very modern.
Yeah, but I think that there's multiple aspects to this. On one hand, I think it's really important to go, so people go, oh, so you don't think there's any room for monasteries anymore? And I'm like an oblate at a monastery. So I go, but make it real, the point, right, that any monk, nun, or hermit, when they renounce the world, bud, they're renouncing what is good for something better.
Yeah.
So if you make it where it's like the monasteries are the place you run away because the world's wicked and evil, then you're being a Cathar, or you're being a Manichaean, right? There's the evil God and the good God, and I'm choosing the good one. No. As Catholics, we have to say, even the devil is good insofar as he exists. That's a quote from Thomas Aquinas, not me. And so when we relinquish the things of the world, we relinquish things that have goods in and of themselves. Yes, they can be perverted. There's I'm not trying to act like all things are good. But the point is to say your relinquishment, and they tell you this when you're discerning, your relinquishment should never be to run and hide from something. It should be a will in control of itself, willingly giving up something and handing over the will to God through this renunciation into, the vow of poverty or something like this. So that's on one hand. The second one is, it's certainly the case that within the cultures that we run into, pagan ones, non-Western ones, all these things like this, that there's elements that are better or worse, of course, and that actually Christianity really struggled with sometimes. As much as I'm a fan of a lot of medieval history, certainly a lot of the aspects of feudalism that really were not good was the church maybe trying too hard to adapt to the sort of Germanic tribes' social institutions. We had to figure out how to wrestle with that. I think, but that's the important part is they were willing to wrestle with those things. And I agree that you go, hey, maybe there's just not a lot of transcendence here to latch onto. But I think of like Tertullian saying, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? So this idea of having parts of the church who were like, we really shouldn't get involved with paganism at all. I mean, that goes all the way back to the book of Acts, bud, where people are like, Peter, you really shouldn't even eat with the Gentiles. And Paul confronts him to his face and says, no, that you're missing out on the risk it means to have Gentiles involved, but the good that comes from that. So I would say my argument is no matter what any modernist philosophy says, hidden within it somewhere is a spark for transcendence. They might do all they can to suppress it or put it somewhere else, but it's our job to find in this world that is very flattened of the transcendent. I completely agree. Where that spark lays dormant and stoke that spark. That doesn't mean, again, that we need to flatten the Gospels. It doesn't mean that we need to do everything we can to sort of like give a hackneyed translation into modern ideas. It does mean, though, that we have to go looking for the sparks, no matter how dormant they are in this culture, and precisely go there to start making the fire of faith burn once again.
I think that first point that you make about the monasteries is so important. Because a monastery, for a lot of even Catholics, when we look at monks and nuns, we think that's like the highest form of renunciation or withdrawal from the world. And there is an element of that to it. But if you think about how monasteries have actually functioned historically, I think it really does cast a light on what faithfulness would look like in our times, because for the monks of like the Middle Ages, what they were doing, I kind of joked about the Amish option or whatever, but it's a renunciation that's in a different key, because they saw the gifts that they were preserving as gifts for the entire community. And I think the loss of monasteries, like in our country, in our culture, has really had dramatic effects that we probably don't even realize. But so like in medieval towns, like the monastery had treasures that were necessary for the flourishing of the entire community. And like there would be charitable opportunities or like opportunities for counseling and healing that were only available because the monastery had a distinct presence within the larger town and social order.
I mean, I even put it that a lot of the technological innovations of that time happened in monasteries. Yeah. So the sort of they were dealing with old text, right? Like, so any sort of scriptural, like scriptorum innovations, mostly at monasteries. I mean, it began to be the universities, but I think people forget that that's not until, the 1100s that we really get universities taking this over. But a lot of agricultural, maybe the 10s. 1100s is when it really starts getting good. But But a lot of the agricultural innovations, Bud, that I think people forget how important those are. I mean, monasteries to us seem sort of Amish because we're like, oh, yeah, they're quaint, they're out in the country, they're praying. Yeah. But you go, there's not much technology they didn't have at the time that other people did. It's not like, oh, yeah, you could go into London where all the televisions were. Mm-hmm. I mean, there wasn't, like, plays, I suppose. But, you know, like, people in monasteries still had to, like, farm and things like this. The biggest thing they renounced, Bud, was war, where that would be the other main seat of technological innovation through most of the ancient world and the Middle Ages. Yeah. So I think sometimes we let our romanticism about, oh, wouldn't this perfect idyllic past, you know, that monasteries are vacation homes. That, I think, is actually the problem. Not now, do I agree that monasteries, if there's going to be a place where there's just silence and there isn't electronics, yes, absolutely, monasteries should mostly be that. But I don't think it's a problem that Clear Creek Abbey, which is about as, like, old school as you can get, has a website where you can buy stuff from their store. Yeah. And I don't think that that's bad. I think that's mostly in keeping with what they were like in the Middle Ages.
Well, and I think with our families and with our parishes, like, this is a real challenge where there is a way where America, or we could say capitalism, kind of corrupted even the family, where the family became this, like, nuclear unit, where it really was the vision that was cast was like, we keep folks out. And this can become sort of like a safe haven in a dark world or whatever. With our parishes, obviously, when we think about evangelism, we're going to say to folks, like, to truly appreciate the fullness of these gifts, there are things you'll have to sacrifice or let go, but it's for the sake of a greater gift and a greater joy. And our parishes really, we'd be fumbling away our vacation.
So you want to go on one?
Yeah. My mind's what's the American getaway? Southwest. $59 trip to Fort Lauderdale, which is worse than Des Moines. But like, we're fumbling away our vocation if we present the church as, I guess, as a bunker where you can avoid temptations. And this gets back to the monastery point, because I know for myself, spiritually speaking, I've always thought, like, if I was just a monk, I wouldn't face these, you know, like right. I would, like, distraction just would not be a problem. No, like, they actually go into, I think, like, you could say it's like actually a deeper engagement with reality.
Yeah.
They're not, like, trying to, like, hold reality at bay. They're, like, facing, like, if I'm going to take seriously, like, this call to discipleship, I have to be able to be silent. And so it's keyed in a different way, but it's the same kind of struggles that we all face, both as individuals and as church communities.
I mean, think about a life where your neighbor is a fellow monk and they all live next to you. And if they sing bad, you have your entire rest of your life to notice. And if they're not good at anything helpful around, you know, the monastery, you guys might not have cheese that year. I mean, so, you know, it's absolutely the case that this idea that, again, we all will think of it like, well, we'll go to the monastery. That must be nice because that's an escape from the world and you come back. But look, you talk about the sort of Vatican II concept that gets all sorts of airplay where they talk about the laity are...
The universal call to holiness.
But, but then there really is this idea that the laity have a job in spreading the gospel. This what goes into what we mean by, like, a neighborhood, recapping all of this idea. How do we speak to people where we're not just giving them, like, bullet point elevator pitch 4 spiritual laws, but that we know how to translate the reality of the cause of our joy to people's lives? Man, you got to be able to talk to people long enough. They got to know you enough from either work or your neighborhood that they'll actually be vulnerable enough to tell you what's wrong with their lives. So not that you can give, like, advice, but that so you could, even at the beginning of saying, I don't know what exactly to tell you. I know in my life, this is what the gospel does. Yeah. Like, that's how you evangelize. And I mean, again, that's something where I think you, and especially Rachel, a shout out to your wife, an overwhelming example of how that works. Or that, you know, at work, again, it's not a matter of, like, I'm going to think about how to, like, turn this water cooler conversation into, a sword drill where I recite a psalm. But certainly if you are good and kind and trustworthy and you go the extra mile and you're selfless, people will eventually come and ask you, what is the cause of your joy, right? That is the sort of what Peter says. You have to defend the hope that is in you. And people will see that hope if you live that in your interactions with them. And I think that is what we are called to this Easter season. It's why we're reading the book of Acts, to go spread the good news. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. For everybody who's listening on air throughout Iowa, wherever Iowa Catholic Radio signal airs, or if you're listening on live on iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and then, of course, all of our podcast listeners, thank you for listening to the show. Well, Bud, we started with the book of Acts, but then I think we went to Europe and America and all the way to technology. Yeah. But I'm hoping that people start to see that whatever else we're supposed to dwell on, and there's all sorts of things we can dwell on in this wonderful season as we celebrate Easter, part of it is to think of our role in spreading the good news of what is celebrated this Easter season. And I hope we gave some people a bit of insight and maybe things to ruminate on about how it is that they already can be heralds of the good news.
That's right. And I appreciate your mention of the app coming out of the break. I was thinking about the Iowa Catholic Radio app on my back porch this week.
Okay.
Because in my car, I can catch the Cardinals broadcast out of Newton. I'm not going to mention the station that airs it, but so when I'm driving home from work, I can sometimes hear the Cards playing. But I get on my patio and I'm grilling out, and I just can't do it. So it's great to have the Iowa Catholic Radio app, which you can download on your phone, listen anytime, anywhere. Use it to pray the rosary, but we also broadcast the rosary at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. And then the Chaplet of Divine Mercy, which we just had like a liturgical recognition of the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon.
So if I'm not mistaken, right, don't you say your kids, the boys, listen to you sometimes with this?
Yeah, my sons who are 6 and 4, my daughters have known about the show for a while, but recently, the sons kind of stumbled on the show, and they think it's just amazing to hear Dad's voice coming out of a box.
So do they only listen live, or do you, throw the app at them as well?
No, they started listening live, so instead of Saturday morning cartoons, the kids are subjected to my radio show.
We are kind of like the Looney Tunes, so it works out. Well, in addition to how people can pray, like you said, the times and how you can do that, if you also go to iowacatholicradio.com, you can look up what all is happening in the Diocese of Des Moines, but of course also the Iowa Catholic listenership area that I think mostly is the Diocese of Des Moines, but actually I think hits some of the others as well. But we're trying to do more things in other parts of the listening areas, so make sure to stay tuned to that. But just a couple from the website, Iowa Catholic Radio online auction, April 24th through May 5th. Including a round of golf at the Wakanda Club with Catholic Morning Show host John Leonetti. That should be an easy victory. Attend every show at the 2023 Iowa State Fair Grandstand. Sign Scotty Magruder guitar. And mission trips to Africa through Blessman International with Father Ray McHenry. Check out the items, iowacatholicradio.com. And thank you for the support of Iowa Catholic Radio. Connecting listeners to Christ, everybody who has contributed to that. The next Man Up Power Lunch is Friday, May 12th at St. Francis of Assisi Parish, where we're going to have Deacon Matthew Hallbach sharing St. Joseph in the power of restraint. Rome Beneath the Surface with Deacon Omar Gutierrez, host of the Catholic Hour with the Evangelium Institute, is Saturday, June 16th at 7 p.m., again at St. Francis of Assisi. Walker Hayes presented by Fairway with Iowa Catholic Radio Foundation, July 15th at the Community Choice Credit Union Convention Center Ballroom in Des Moines. For King and Country with special guests, We Are the Kingdom will be at the Iowa State Fair Thursday, August 10th, 8 p.m. at the Grandstand. And then finally, the Iowa Catholic Radio 15th Anniversary Footprints of God Pilgrimage to the Holy Land with Steve Ray, Matt Wilkham, and Father P.J. McManus, November 2023. All of this you can go check out at iowacatholicradio.com, which, Bud, also is the place where you can donate. You can donate on iowacatholicradio.com. The Iowa Catholic Radio app, or 515-223-1150. Folks, This ministry is not just the people talking like Bud and I here or the people behind the boards or in the office, but it is certainly you who listen, and we are able to have this ministry occur because of your donations and your goodwill offering. So please consider those, iowacatholicradio.com, 515-223-1150. Thank you for your support of the show. Bud, like you said, wonderful show, wonderful weather, a good time to get out and enjoy God's creation, but then maybe just by sharing Easter joy, evangelize in sharing that sort of glory of what we're going through right now.
Time is relentless, my man. Already doing Iowa State Fair announcements, but I'm going to try to reside in that Easter joy for at least a few more weeks here.
Absolutely. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our families, city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we will be back with you next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for the Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.